Welcome to Redundancy Matters with me, June Hogan. I'm a qualified career coach and outplacement specialist, and I've got a background in HR. And this is the podcast where I help HR professionals and leaders managing redundancies to put people at the heart of the process. In today's episode, I'm chatting with Pete Colby, Director and Chief Mediator at Pragmatism UK. I first met Pete when we were both starting our businesses, and I was fascinated by his experience, so it's a real pleasure to have him on the podcast today. Pete spent years leading large-scale redundancy programmes at places like British Steel and Rolls-Royce, and he's also experienced redundancy himself. We talk honestly about what it's really like on both sides of the table, how to work with trade unions, and why empathy and genuine consultation make all the difference. So if you're a HR professional or leader facing tough change, this conversation will give you some reassurance, some insight, and also lots to think about. And if you want to go deeper into managing redundancies, you'll find a link in the show notes to register for a free monthly lunch and learn session where my colleague and redundancy expert Robin and I explore different aspects of managing redundancies. And you'll also find lots of resources on my website, wildwoodcoaching.co.uk. Okay, let's dive into today's episode. Welcome to today's episode of Redundancy Matters. I'm delighted to be joined today by Pete Colby, who is the Director and Chief Mediator at Pragmatism UK. And I'm really looking forward to talking to Pete to share his experiences of managing redundancies and some of the large-scale programmes that he'd been involved in prior to establishing Pragmatism. So thanks so much for joining me today, Pete.
No, very welcome, and thanks for inviting me, June. Really appreciate it.
Wonderful. So do you just want to introduce yourself to the listeners today?
Yeah, so as you say, I'm Pete Colby. I run a business called Pragmatism because I don't believe that any policy, law or process applies when it comes to people, because you need to be pragmatic. Our business is mainly mediation and training mediators, so very much curing and preventing disputes. But my history is predominantly in HR, with about 4 or 5 years in the middle of factory management, operational management, but mainly HR in sort of heavy manufacturing, heavily unionised environment. So mainly British Steel, then the food industry, and then latterly for the last 10 years was Rolls-Royce, and set up Pragmatism at the end of 2018.
We've been in business a similar amount of time, and that was how we met, wasn't it, originally?
It was.
Business startup programs. So tell me, why does redundancy matter to you?
I just think when you look at what especially HR people do, and my experience of working in HR for many years, actually count it in decades, I think other than fatalities, I think redundancy is the hardest thing that you can deal with, whether that's as a HR person, a manager, or being on the other side. Because basically, the way I describe redundancy is dismissing people for no reason that they've done wrong, and that's really harsh. And the trauma that people can go through in a redundancy situation is huge. I think it's one of the most stressful things people can go through, and we can make such a difference in how we manage redundancies. It can really change people's lives. So I think it's just critical.
And as you say that you've been involved in some large scale programs for your work in HR over the years, I'm wondering if you can reflect on that first time you had to make someone redundant, or the first time you were involved in a redundancy process. Any reflections you can share when it happened for the first time for you?
So I think the first time I made redundancies was back in the 90s in British Steel. And obviously British Steel, during my tenure in British Steel, I made over 3,000 people redundant, which is not pleasant. But going back to the very first ones, I think the first consultations I did individually were relatively easy, because we had people who were really hoping for redundancy, and they were up for voluntary redundancy programs, and it was great news and things. And it was this sense of, actually, this is quite easy. And then I always remember my first difficult consultation, and it was basically a grown man who cried and literally said he would get on his knees and beg if there was anything I could do to make him not lose his job. And it was that, I'll never forget that meeting as a young HR or personnel at the time manager. And it was just like, oh my God, that made me realize what this is for people. A grown man who can't see a way forward of feeding his family. It was like, this is not just a process. This is a real people thing. And I guess I was lucky enough at the time to, just before that, have trained as a mediator, and that's when I started 30 years ago next year, which is a bit scary. But that made me realise that actually this stuff, although it's a process and it's a really difficult process, it really is about people, and you can make a huge difference in how you enact redundancies if in fact that is the end result.
Yeah, just listening to what you said there gave me kind of goosebumps just thinking about how that stayed with you all
Mhm.
those years. And I remember something similar, and I can still see the person's face. And I remember looking into their eyes, and just their eyes were filled with tears. And I just thought to myself, are you going to be okay? I hope, what more can I do to support you? That feeling of rescuing, which I know we have to maintain our boundaries when we're working in these sorts of situations. But on a human level, you can't but help feel for people in what, as you say, is a traumatic and devastating situation for many.
Absolutely.
So you mentioned there about having to do individual consultations and then larger scale programs as well, and your involvement with the unionized environment. So from for people who are listening who've not had to manage trade unions in a redundancy process or even engage with them in their organizations, how do you bring trade unions in to that redundancy process in that partnership approach so that the two of you can work together?
I think you can do it in two ways, and I'd only advocate one way. The way that I wouldn't advocate is probably the most common way that I do see, and that is bringing the unions in because you have to, because we're ticking a box to consult, but we already know the decisions, and it's just whether it's 30-day, 90-day, whatever, it's just a box that you've got to tick, and you know it's going to be a few difficult meetings, but then you're going to make however many people redundant because you've already made the decision. That's the way I wouldn't approach it. The way I would advocate people approach it, and it's funny actually because I was just having a conversation yesterday with a client about a potential big restructuring that they've got challenges with the unions and things. And what I would always advocate is taking the brave pill and talking to them as early as possible. Because when you do genuine consultation, then you can get some quite spectacular results. And, or you may not, but even when you don't change the outcome, at least you've explored every possibility of mitigating those redundancies. Because what we're saying is there's a business change that means that we might have to sack people for for not doing anything wrong. And actually, if we can mitigate that and that impact, and even if it's just one person that doesn't have to get on their knees and cry, brilliant. It's all about trying to mitigate that impact on people. And so the more talking, more importantly, the more listening that we can do with people who are affected, with their representatives, then it can only be a better outcome. And actually, when people know that you've done everything you can, it is more. There's less of a stress for them because they know that you're on their side. They know that you've helped. They know you want to help, compared to the frustrations of not doing so.
So, in terms of bringing them in early, when would you say is a good time to do that? And how would you do that around the notion of protecting confidentiality and that kind of thing? Any thoughts and guidance on that?
So I think one of the mistakes that organisations make is they wait until there is a potential redundancy programme to then think, oh, we now need to engage well with the trade unions and things. So anybody who's listening who's not in a redundancy situation yet, I would say start building those relationships now. So it's all about trust and it's all about relationships. So the more that we can build the trust with the trade unions, the more we can be a little bit brave on sharing where the business is at, what the business challenges are, what the business opportunities are, bringing them into that sort of. I always describe leadership as management plus employees. And of course, employees are those reps.
Mm.
So for me, utopia in this world is that your trade union is part of your leadership team. And I know that will scare the hell out of most people, but then you don't need to consult. You don't need to do a lot of the things that legislation tells you to do because they're in it. They're part of it. But the more that we can lay those foundations early, the more trust starts to build. And yes, you could argue that there'll never be 100% trust. Fine. But actually, the more you can trust people and the more that you can do more than you have to do on sharing information, there's so much you can do that builds trust and therefore lays the foundations. But as I say, as early as possible, sharing those business challenges. And there's always going to be a worry that they'll go off and break confidentiality and things. But if you think about it from their perspective, that's not good for them, because if they breach confidentiality and they tell them things that their members have got hundreds of questions about, it's going to be them that they come to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've worked with some incredible trade union reps who, when you're in the process and they're representing their colleagues in the meetings, have been hugely helpful. And having that representation, I think, makes a huge difference. But as you say, it goes back to the very start, before this was even kind of on the cards, as it were, and having that relationship all the way through. And I know that you have some personal experience of redundancy on the other side of the table, and two very different experiences. Would you be able to share with us what those experiences were like and what made them different?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been made redundant twice, and I would say on both occasions it was the worst thing that could have happened to me at the time. It was the first occasion was when I just bought my first house with my then girlfriend and was mortgaged to the hilt. And then they announced that the site was closing. And then latterly, it always seems to be when I buy houses. I don't think I'll ever buy another house. Latterly, it was when we bought the house that we live in now, and I'd done a big reconstruction job and borrowed a lot of money and things like that, and then found out my job was being made redundant. So just as devastating as regards the messaging, but the way it was managed, I would say, was completely polar opposite. The first time was just really good. My manager, he talked to me. And this was, I left school at 16. I didn't have many qualifications. And he did what he needed to do to tick boxes for legislation, etc. But he sat down with all of us and he had career chats with us and what do you want to do and things like that. And his conversation with me was, look, you haven't got that many qualifications, but you've probably got something about you. And why don't you go to college, university, up your qualifications? And I was like, because I've got a mortgage to pay. But those conversations gave me the confidence in a way to say, do you know what? I'm gonna study in the day and I'm gonna get a job at night. So I used to pack boxes for a Tesco distribution place at night to pay the mortgage. But in the day I was studying. And I was shattered for what, 3 years? But it was that conversation that he had with me that no legislation told him to do, but he had a really good chat with me that gave me the boost to then up my qualifications. And I would say it's thanks to him that I then suddenly got some other jobs and work for prestigious companies like Rolls-Royce and do what I do now. If he'd not had that conversation with me, because what my job there was a warehouse operative. And I'd probably still be a warehouse operative if he'd not had that conversation with me. So looking back, it's redundancy enabled that brilliant conversation. And that is a conversation that nowadays probably it would be yourself that would be helping, where organisations recognise the huge value in what you do. They're the conversations that are going to help people. I was just really lucky that I had a manager that could have those conversations. The second time, it was unbelievably bad. The manager who was supposed to give the messages didn't want to afford the time to give them the messages. Got Even though he was based in the same building as us, so he got one of his direct reports to come from Scotland to deliver the messages instead. And it was just a real farce of a process. And of course, when you make somebody redundant who knows how to make people redundant, then there becomes a bit of tension. I probably shouldn't share too much because I'm bound by a bit of a confidentiality agreement on that one, but it was the most shockingly bad situation, but was probably 10 times more stressful for me than the other one because I knew I had somebody, the organisation that was supporting me. The latter one was quite the opposite. It was the thing that then made me decide to set up Pragmatism and things like that. In hindsight, I wouldn't change either, but I would change how it was done.
And thank you for sharing those. And really interesting, the theme there was the line manager
Absolutely.
and the impact that both of those extremes had. And that ability for line managers to step out of the process, which the line manager, when you were working in the warehouse, was happy to do, comfortable to do, have that conversation. He didn't need to do that, but was willing to do that because I'm guessing that was how he was as a leader. He hadn't just changed when redundancy started, I'm guessing.
No, and the other big difference I didn't mention as well, the person who did it really well, his job was gone as well. He was being made redundant as well. The person who did it really badly was safe and was fine. But the person that he asked to come from Scotland to do the messages, their job was being made redundant as well. So everything comes down to leadership, everything.
And the messages, that it's not a small thing, but the message that I'm too busy, it's not important, I'll send someone else, that again sets the tone for the whole thing because automatically everyone's thinking, why couldn't you come and do it yourself? Or
Yeah, absolutely.
so yeah, as you said, the leaders are central to all of this. Yes, as a HR profession, we're there to make sure people stay within the law. We're there to make sure that managers are well prepared and that they understand what they need to do and how to support individuals. But fundamentally, even when I'm in the room or have been in the room with leaders, they are taking the lead. They have to own this process because these are their people, aren't they?
Absolutely. And I'm being on the other side of things because obviously I've been that leader in whether it's the HR person or people that work for me. And it's just going that extra, you can't do everything, but just somebody knowing that you're there, if knowing that you care and knowing that you're there if needed, it goes such a long way, such a long way.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that notion of showing that you care, as you said there, and being available for people when you're in managing a large scale program, and particularly maybe you're working with the leadership team at a senior level, and you're looking to ensure, as we said before, the whole point of consultation is to avoid redundancies. How do you influence and support the leadership team in those situations where maybe they're being presented with proposals and ideas and suggestions and you're having to influence and guide them through that? How does that work and what advice would you have for others who are working in that situation?
So I think the main thing for me is I think there's an education piece for people, effective consultation, because I think most organisations go into this as a fait accompli. It is, we've made the decisions, this is what we're going to do. It comes across very clearly to employees. And I think to educate the leaders that are involved in these consultations about the value of real, genuine consultation is such an important thing. And even if the decision is the same as it started out, when people feel that at least they've been listened to and they've had the reasoning explained, it's a much more acceptable situation than when it's just dismissed and it just seems like it's a tick box. But I've had so many examples where consultation has changed things, whether it's not always, it avoids redundancies. Most of the time it might be it avoids one or two, but there's always this moment where leaders who do genuine consultation have a bit of a light bulb moment because when they're listening to people who actually do the jobs and they're listening to people and their concerns, because most employees are concerned about the organisation as well, and when they start to get some of those insights on what that could mean for the organisation, when they listen, they often start to think a little bit more deeply and a bit more widely about what these business decisions that they're taking. And what no organisation really wants to do is what some do quite regularly, and that's a redundancy programme one year, a recruitment drive the next year, and then a redundancy programme. That's not an organisation that many people will want to work in.
Absolutely. And so much as we talked about before about having that relationship with the trade unions, building that relationship with the leadership team outside of this process, clearly having those strong relationships as a business partner, head of HR, whatever your title might be, in order to then be able to build on that when you're partnering in what can be a difficult and complex and busy process. What have you learnt about how to develop those strong relationships with the leadership team?
Again, I think it comes back to what I said about trade unions. I think build those relationships with the leadership team before this process happens, because otherwise they'll just see you as the person that's doing this. But having said that, I've managed redundancy or partnered with senior leaders on redundancy programs, and I've never met them before. We had a redundancy program in Rolls-Royce where it was a global change, and the finance director for Rolls-Royce, he was not based in the same place as me. I never met him, but I was his support for that redundancy program. And it came back to the same thing. A very busy person who initially sees consultation as something HR tell him he's got to do, which is a bit of a pain for him because it means it's going to delay the reducing the people and therefore saving the cost. And that whole investing time with him on letting him, somebody who's never been made redundant, never experienced that, understanding what that does mean for people and establishing whether he actually cares about that. And thankfully he did. But then just laying the foundations of what that consultation will be and warming him up to the fact that you may get alternative suggestions and how are we going to deal with those, because there's two ways you can deal with it. You can just chuck it back and say that's a load of rubbish, and or leave it for a bit of time and give a pretense that you've thought about it, or you can genuinely look into it. And having that discussion with people before it all happens, because what you're doing is you're educating them and you're training them on what proper consultation is. And one of the things I often say to people in these situations is, if this was your son, daughter, husband, wife, or whatever, whose job was at risk and they were in a real state, what would you want their employer to do? And usually the answer to that, if they genuinely answer that question, that's what you should do in your consultation process. So I think there's a lot of foundational stuff before you then get into that consultation. And so even just basic education on what, because a lot of people don't know the difference between consultation and negotiation. And of course, in negotiation, both parties have got to agree. And in consultation, one person makes a decision or one party makes a decision. And yes, it will be the organisation that makes that decision, but you don't want to manipulate that. You want to genuinely listen to the people who are being affected by that. So build good foundations and you'll get a better result.
I love what you said there about that balance between sharing the human impact of redundancy as well as the process that you're going to have to operate in, and getting people to connect with what's about to happen, what the decisions they're going to have to make, the sorts of conversations they're going to have before you get into what consultation means and how does that all work. I think what you said there about anchoring it back to how would you want someone to be treated, how would you like to be treated, because lots of people won't have experienced redundancy, but I'm guessing most will know someone maybe in the family or friendship group who's had experience, because it is more commonplace than it used to be years ago when it first happened to me. And helping people to make that connection that it is about people, essentially. This is about, it's roles that will be lost. We know it's not about the people themselves, essentially, but the people are the ones that will be impacted. And thinking about how, particularly, as we said before, redundancies can be all-consuming because as a HR professional, you've got to keep all the other plates spinning and it can get quite overwhelming. And what I learnt was around managing boundaries in terms of, as we said at the start, on a human level, you will feel for these people. I used to drive home and be thinking about the conversations that I'd had. What guidance have you got around managing boundaries so that as a HR team or leaders as well, they don't get overwhelmed and that they can still show up and give what they need to in this process?
Yeah, I think the worst thing is where you've got big boundaries and therefore you don't let people in and you're just doing it as a tick box. But you can lower your boundaries too much as well. The temptation is that person who's on their knees crying to give them your personal mobile, catch up with them at the weekend, see how they are, and things like that. That's obviously, you need to not step over those boundaries because at the end of the day, you're doing a job and you're going to do that job to as good a way as you can and as people focused as you can. But when you're not in that job, that's not your that's not your responsibility. So I think it's really important to have those clear personal boundaries. In terms of, I've been in that situation as well as regards you're already full, but here's a redundancy program to manage. I've always been fairly not too shy in saying no. If you want me to do that, this is what I'll suggest I drop. But there's no way that I'm going to do a redundancy program and only give it the 10% of what it needs to be given. Most of those other things won't be as important and won't be as vital as this program that they're running. I think it's a case of either stop doing certain things or bring in additional resource to either manage the redundancy program or preferably manage some of the other things, because if it's a redundancy program and I know the people, I'd rather do that because I want them to have people that they know talking to them about the redundancy process. I think there's a number of boundary elements, but you've got to set yourself up for. There's no point us talking about train managers, prepare them, lay the foundations and things if you've only got half an hour a week to do it. You're just not going to be able to do it. Not possible.
Mm. Yeah, and I like what you said there about having that conversation that says, I'm going to need to devote a lot of time to this to do it properly and to give people the respect that they deserve in this process and to do it well. And this sounds to me like something I can pause until the program's finished or whatever. So having that upfront conversation. And as you said there about those boundaries, and there's a phrase, and I will misquote this because I haven't prepared to say it, but Brené Brown, who I'm a big fan of, she talks about having a boundary, or personal boundaries, like a fence. So there's a fence and there's a gate. And I might lean over the gate to offer my support and my empathy and do what I can to help you. But I will never open that gate because that's the boundary that keeps us both safe. And the notion of, if somebody was drowning and there's a life ring, it's more helpful to throw the life ring to them than for you to jump in and for both of you to end up in a bad situation. And those are principles I use with coaching, and I'm sure maybe in mediation that's similar for you guys as well. I think those are quite nice visuals, if you like, to remember where your boundaries are and also maybe to notice if you might be crossing them. And that's one thing that, if you've got that awareness of where your boundaries begin and end, if you notice that you are stepping over them, you can pull yourself back to safety.
I really like that analogy with the fence and the gate because that's exactly what it is. So leading over whilst you can, but not opening the gate. And it's interesting because in mediations, I see a lot of cases, a lot of disputes where there's a poor HR person in the middle of it who's on getting the brunt of the dispute and getting the brunt of the complaints. And the reason for that is they've come in and tried to help. They've stepped over boundaries and they've had personal conversation or whatever, and then suddenly you've got an unhappy employee that will fire bullets at whoever's in front of them, and it's the HR person who actually just did what they were trying to do to be helpful. And it's such a shame when people have to go through that sort of thing. Yeah, I'll steal that one with the fence and the gate.
Well, after this episode, I'll look it up and be able to share it with you. But yeah, visually, I can see it. And it's something I said, I think it's quite a good analogy was the word I was looking for. You can tell this is live because otherwise I'd sound really prepared. So, Pete, what would you be your sort of final sort of two or three reflections for someone who is going to be entering into a redundancy process? Unfortunately, we tend to find that at this time of the year, the last quarter tends to be a time when, as an outplacement provider, we tend to get quite busy, and year end and redundancies can regrettably coincide with that. What would be some of the final things that you just like to share with people who are listening who may be going to be entering into that process in the next kind of few months?
I think the first one would be to utilise outplacement support. That's something that I've never had. I suppose my manager tried to, in that first one, tried to do some of that. But if that had been a professional doing that, then that would have been really good. It would have definitely helped in the latter one. So the first one would be that outplacement support. The second would be that prep that I've said a few times about thinking about that. The boundaries is really important. Just only doing this if you can afford the time to do this. The other bit I would say, and I know I've mentioned it a few times, sometimes you can almost perform what seem to be miracles when it comes to real consultation. The biggest one for me was ever, again, Rolls-Royce. We had a lot of redundancies and things, but we had a situation in Derby where we were facing potentially 2,000 redundancies, which is obviously huge. One of the proudest parts of my career was that redundancy consultation, because with really long nights, long consultations, lots of potentially arguments and debates and various things, when you get to a certain level and you think, actually, this is potentially achievable, we went from 2,000 potential redundancies to no compulsory redundancies. And some of the things that got us there, we would never have dreamt of to start with. But it was only through lots and lots of time and brainstorming and genuinely both the unions and the management desperately wanting to not make people redundant in a compulsory way. So obviously some of that was voluntary and everything like that. So that fitted with people. But it also included things like adult apprenticeships, because we knew that we were losing valuable experience. It also included things like, people don't like the term now, 0 hours contracts, but so we ended up calling it alumni because it sounds posher. People who actually would quite like to leave, but would like to do contractual work when needed to utilize their skills. Things like that all came out of consultation. And so there was nobody out of those 2,000 people at risk that was really unhappy about the outcome. There might have been quite a few that it wasn't their ideal, but they either kept jobs or they left doing something that they wanted to pursue.
Wow. And when you said that, it's one of the proudest things that you've
Mm,
done. It sounds amazing to think
mm,
that you were facing 2,000 redundancies and through creativity and listening and, as you say, genuine consultation and a willingness and a desire to avoid redundancies, which is, as we said before, that's what consultation is all about. It's not just
mm.
going through the motions, that
Yeah.
you're able to deliver that. It sounds fantastic.
Yeah. And part of that is getting the trade unions and the workforce to understand the reasons for, because usually it's about saving costs, but looking at alternative, because suddenly when you can start to say to people or to organizations, okay, you need to save X million, here's an idea that saves 500,000,
Mm.
but it means keeping those. If it really is genuinely about the cost of the business, headcount is not always the only answer. There's plenty of other things that, and of course, that's why I say about the adult apprenticeships and things. There's always implications with cutting headcount, especially when you've got very experienced people and you start thinking about the future of the business and succession planning and skill gaps and all that. There's a lot to talk about in this sort of arena, and it takes, in that case, months of conversations, not just 90 days or whatever it is, because that's what we're just going to do. It's proper discussions.
Yeah. And the impact of making a decision over here about losing these skills, these roles, this experience, what does that actually do to other areas of the business, as you say, succession planning, planning for the future. So seeing it as a holistic exercise as opposed to, as you said, we need to reduce costs. The easiest thing probably just to reduce some heads over there and then we can tick that box. Yeah, wonderful.
That's just a spreadsheet analysis decision.
Yeah. And I don't know about you, but I never enjoyed spreadsheets when I worked in it.
Not particularly, no.
Oh, Pete, I've so enjoyed our conversation today and all that you've shared from your personal perspective on both sides of that redundancy table and the experiences that have had an impact on you and with the approach that you've taken through managing what must have been some very challenging times when you were working in British Steel and in Rolls-Royce. And so tell me about what you do now and how people can find you if they need to bring you in for mediation, etc.
So what we do now is very similar to what I've just talked about, because when we're mediators and when people get into disputes, what we're all about is trying to find solutions that work for both parties or all parties. And that's what mediation is about, is trying to find those resolutions going forward. So Pragmatism as a business, we go in and we mediate disputes, but actually what we're all about is preventing them in the first place. So we train mediators, we train managers to have what we could tend to call difficult conversations. They're only difficult because they don't have the confidence. They don't have the confidence because they don't know the skill. They don't have the skills. They don't have the tools and the techniques. So that's very much two sides of the business, the cure and the prevention side. Yeah, so anybody who wants to get, I'm on LinkedIn. Pete Colby, Colby. And then our website is, I can never remember this, I can remember that, pragmatism-uk.co.uk. But yeah, it's happy to talk to anybody who wants to talk about this stuff.
Wonderful. And I'll put all the links to that in the show notes as well. So yeah, thank you so much, Pete. I've really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you for giving up your time today to share those experiences. It's been really interesting.
No, I enjoyed it. Always good to catch up with you, June.
Thank you so much for listening to the Redundancy Matters podcast. I hope you found today's episode helpful. It would mean a lot to me if you would follow, rate and review this podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts, as this helps it reach more people who are managing redundancies. Let me know what you thought, and if you have ideas for future episodes, I'd love to hear from you. You can find me on LinkedIn, June Hogan, and get in touch via my website, wildwoodcoaching.co.uk, where you'll also find more resources to help you manage redundancies. I hope you'll join me again soon for the next episode of Redundancy Matters.